Hi, I'm Tom Griffiths, historian, writer and a former employee of this wonderful institution of the State Library of Victoria. During the 1980s, every day of my working life I'd walk through this domed reading room, and it never failed to lift my heart with its beauty. My job was, as field officer, to collect historic manuscripts, pictures and photographs for the Australiana research collections here. The historian who most influenced me was Greg Denning, whose book I'm going to read from. Greg was a Pacific historian, an anthropologist, a gentle, generous man, a wonderful writer and a brilliant teacher. He inspired a whole generation of young historians, and the ethnographic school of history of which he was a part is internationally known as the Melbourne School. It might take some imagination to see the great domed reading room of the Victorian State Library as a beach. But it was a beach for me one day in 1958. I remember it well. I made a crossing that day. It was a wet day. Rain dripped from a great height into buckets strategically placed on the floor. I was seated at my favourite reading table. If Karl Marx needed to sit always in the same place in the British Library, we lesser beings have a right to use the same sort of security blanket. The green leather of the reading table was inscribed with various initials, presumably of persons even less secure in their identity than Marx or I. Fu had been there too, proboscis and all. A number of damp and odorous homeless men sat around me. They had come in out of the rain, spied my clerical collar, and felt it would somehow protect them from the ire of the librarians, who sat high, overlooking us in the axle of the library's escalating spokes of reading tables. No doubt Jeremy Bentham inspired more than prison wardens when he planned a geometry of total surveillance. The State Library was born of the wealth of the gold rush and the ambition of Melbourne to become the Southern Hemisphere's most civilised city. It was a magical place for me. I loved the heavy silence of its great space. It was a silence you could feel on your shoulders, something like standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or in the Australian bush. The few sounds there have a distant feel, like children's voices in a schoolyard far away. The hours I spent reading in this library rolled into days, into weeks, into months, maybe even into years. And Greg goes on to explain that on that day in 1958, that wet day here in the library, he read a book called Raft Law, which was published in 1943 to help crashed airmen during the Second World War. And that book had within it all kinds of ancient islander lore about the sea and how to find one's way with the currents and the winds. And that day, sitting here in the library, Greg realised that as a historian of the Pacific, he would also have to become an anthropologist. And that changed the kind of history that he wrote. I think there are many revelatory moments like that that people have experienced in this place every day under the dome. Someone learns to see the world differently.